Сейчас вы увидите лекцию доктора Мелоди де Ягер, моей коллеги из Южной Африки, педагога и специалиста по развитию мозга детей. Эту лекцию мы снимали как часть проекта, очень интересного проекта, который клиника «Прогноз» проводит вместе с режиссером документальных фильмов Юлией Сапоновой. Это фильм-исследование о роли дворовых игр в развитии детей. Фильм-исследование, потому что в нем действительно принимали участие дети. Мы набрали младших школьников, которые, как и многие дети сейчас, много времени проводят перед экранами компьютеров, играют с гаджетами и мало бывают на улице. Мы провели этим детям в прогнозе диагностику, затем они 2 недели играли на улице, потом мы провели повторную диагностику и выяснили, что работа мозга большинства из них изменилась. Мы для фильма возьмем только часть интервью с доктором Мелоди де Ягер, но мне кажется, что это очень интересный, очень важный материал, и поэтому я хочу, чтобы эта лекция существовала сама по себе и чтобы ее увидели многие.
I am Mелоди from the Mindfulness Institute in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I would like to talk about children and play, and why play when I was young was a magical experience. I think all older people like me think when they were young, life was better than now. I don't think it's true. I think we've just been through a very difficult pandemic, which has changed the world forever. But when I was young and living in South Africa, where we have a lot of space, play meant being outside most of the time. That meant playing with your friends in the street. That meant playing outside in the gardens, climbing trees, rolling on the grass, chasing each other. So there were many games that we played, and we played naturally. Because if you watch children all over the world, and it doesn't matter if it's boys or if it's girls. I come from South Africa, where there are many people with a black skin and people with white skin. It doesn't matter what color of your skin, it doesn't matter boy, girl, old or young, all children play in a similar way. So there were many different games. One of my favorite games was I wrote a letter to my love. I love. And the game was a very simple game where children would come together, a group of children, 5 or more. We would hold hands, make a big circle. You sit down and one person gets the opportunity to play first. And they would have a tissue or something in their hand, and they would run on the outside of the circle, and they would softly put down that something behind somebody's back without them knowing about it. And then if you sing, I wrote a letter to my love, and on the way I dropped it once, I dropped it twice, dropped it 3 times over, it wasn't you. And if you are lucky and you could sneak up, you could catch that person with that thing behind them, and they were the next one to go around. So what I loved about the game, it was about love, but not just about love. It was non-competitive, and it required some skill, because you had to drop it very, very softly, and you needed to see if you can drop it in such a way that the children on the other side didn't see either, because otherwise their faces would tell this one. So there were many skills involved. As a child, I didn't think about the skills. I only thought about the games and being together. Many different games. They were, and then it depends on where you lived. If you lived close to the coast, to the sea, the names of the games would change. We would have, there's always a leader. And it's very interesting because leadership is developed from a very early age. Sometimes one child would automatically say, let's play this game. And sometimes the children would say, let's choose a leader. So leaders grow from a very early age. And in this one particular game played close to the sea, they chose 2 leaders, and they would choose children. They would, one for you, because that way they divided the group into equal groups. There were slow children in both groups. There were fast children in both groups. There were big children in both groups. There were little children in both. So the competition was more equal, because one of the things with children's games is the rules. Because anybody who watches children play will always notice how children love rules, because rules organize the game. They love it. We think children don't like rules. We're wrong. They love the rules. And then the one group will be called crows, and the other one would be called crabs from the sea. And the one would, they would come close. The one group would chase the other one, but there were boundaries. It's not, everything is not free. There is boundaries. It's like bringing up children. There are rules and there are boundaries. And within those children's games, the boundaries say you can't go out of it, because when you go out of it, you ruin the game. So there were many games. Lots of games were running games. Lots of them were chasing games. Lots of them were done in a circle to foster a sense of we belong, social development. So inherent in children's games, there's physical development, because the senses are stimulated, the vestibular system is strongly stimulated, motor muscles are developed, sensory motor development is important, laterality is important, the sides of the body, crossing the midline happens spontaneously, and so we go on. But not only physical development, it's emotional development as well, because the moment you get it right, you experience success. It gives you more confidence. You want to do it more, and you want to do it better. And then in time, what happens? You feel part of a group, so you're not excluded. You're part of something. It's a different family. It's a friend family. And then cognitively as well, because cognitive skills have their origin in natural play the world over. It is fascinating to see that children all over the world, if they're rich or poor, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which continent or island they live in. They tend to play the same games. Why? Because it's instinct. There's an instinct that drives a child to play certain games, to develop certain skills, that develop certain parts of the brain that leads to cognition. One of my favorite things about children's games is if you leave children, if you leave them alone and there's no outdoor equipment for them to play on or toys to play, there's space and you leave them, you give them some time, and you watch children, they would naturally start an executive process, not different from the CEO of a company, because like a CEO of a company, there's a problem. For these children, there's a problem. They're bored. They've got nothing to do. And in the olden days, nobody took away the children's boredom. They had to do something about that themselves. So the problem is we've got time, we have people. So what will we do? And then they say, analyze the problem, like a CEO. They say, okay, we've got people, we've got space, we've got time, we've got sticks, we've got stones, maybe leaves. What can we do those things? And they come up with a game. Let's start playing. And they play. And if one of the children don't stick to the rules, it's like the CEO monitoring the progress of the process. They say, no, you can't be our friend anymore because you don't play the way like the rules. So children are really leaders, decision makers in the making. And when they finish the game, and obviously somebody is always better than the other, and that's okay, because it's more about the game than it is about who wins the game. And like in any business process, if that process is finished, maybe we want to refine that process and they play it again, but change the rules a little bit, or the time is up, they say goodbye and they all go home. In my house, when I am a mother of 3 grown-up children and I'm a grandmother of 8 grandchildren. And in my house, the rule has always been, and it still is, if the sun is shining, and I live in South Africa, the sun shines a lot. If the sun is shining and the lights in the street aren't on, it is time to be outside, because that's where your body, your heart, your social skills and your cognitive skills develop the most. I became a nursery school teacher because I believe that, as research has shown in many, many countries, if you can develop a child properly, holistically, before the age of 6, their chances of becoming a very well-developed child, a young person, an adult, and then a parent later on, research has shown us it's the way to develop a child best is before the age of 6. So why do I want to work with anybody else other than a child? Because the child is a future. And if we can develop children well, that means we've got a well-developed future. So, but as a nursery school teacher in South Africa means you work with children before they start to learn to read and write. And we have 11 official languages in our country, so language is a very big, it's not a problem, it's just an enormous challenge in our country. Because there are so many languages and children live in groups, they tend not to develop one language of learning. So in the school that I had my own preschool. And in that school, we worked with many, many children, but only in one language, in English. My own language is not English. My own language is Afrikaans. So if I were to say something in my own language, I would say, om met kinders te werk is die grootste vreugde in my lewe. That means to work with children is the greatest joy of my life. But working with these young children, and we really worked hard. I had a marvelous team of teachers. We had good equipment. We had a very good program. We loved the children, but we couldn't get all the children ready to learn to write and read. And that really bothered me. And that was the point in my career when I decided I needed to do something different, because I assumed all children can learn. And I do believe all children can learn, but sometimes things happen that prevents a child from learning. And I wanted to understand that. So I studied psychology, and it helped, but not everybody. So I started asking, but what is it that needs to happen in the brain or in the body? I wasn't at the brain yet, to enable a child to learn, because I always thought cognition, because learning is a form of cognition. I always thought cognition is something abstract. I didn't connect it with the way the brain and the child in totality develop over a period of time. So somebody gave me a book, and it was a photocopy of somebody else's book. And I hate photocopies because that plagiarism, you just don't do that. But I was very grateful for that book, and I bought the original later. In that book, it started talking about the development of the nervous system in the child, and how if the nervous system is not developed properly, it is very difficult to learn. And I thought, but I've never thought of that. So I thought, well, where is the time when a child learns, the nervous system develops the most? And it was when it was a baby, before they talk about the first 1,000 days, from the day of conception, 1,000 days later, it's more or less till a baby is 2 years old. And in that time is the time in our life as a human being that the brain develops the most. The brain can always develop, but never at the speed and the complexity that you find in the first 1,000 days. So the first 1,000 days was very important. I thought, okay, so what happens during the first 1,000 days? And again, maths is my second big love in my life, maths and science. And I looked at what has all children all over the world have in common. And I saw it's the development phases of the baby. All babies suck. All babies need to learn to control their head. All babies roll. Well, I can't say all, most babies. Most babies sit, most babies crawl, most babies stand and walk more or less when they're 1 year old. International research shows only 60% of babies walk on their first birthday. But the moment they can walk, it is a huge indicator of change in the brain. And in my research, I came to realize that every time a baby reaches a milestone, it's not something on the outside. It's just showing on the outside what has just happened on the inside. Because when that baby is rolling from left to right, that baby is developing the sides of the brain and the body. When that baby starts crawling, that baby is crossing the midline. So laterality is established, crossing the midline. When that baby can sit up, that baby has successfully fought the pull of gravity. It's a huge milestone. So infant milestones are actually indicators of brain development. But still, some babies do not reach each of the milestones, and I wanted to know why. And that led me backwards. So I actually studied backwards. And I realized that when the nervous system doesn't develop the way it's supposed to, it can hamper the baby's birth. It can hamper the way the baby develops and goes through the milestones. And if we don't address it in the first 1,000 days, it can hamper a child's ability to learn. So I established an institute called the Baby Gym Institute, where we teach adults to work with babies and their mothers and fathers to enable them to develop the baby optimally. No force. It's all playful, physical movement. Most cultures naturally massage their newborn babies. Why? Because instinctively, we human beings, we are given an instinct to say what is good for this baby. And what is good for the baby is when we massage the baby. Because you activate proprioceptors all over the body that tells the brain what the body looks like. Because the brain is marvelous, but it's in the skull. It needs a map of the body. And when you massage and touch your baby, also the contractions during birth, all of them contribute to creating a map of the body in the brain, because the brain can only control what the brain is aware of. We see that very often when you ask a child who's battling with learning to draw a picture of themselves. Most often, the picture is incomplete. Why is the picture incomplete? It's not because they forgot something. They draw what they are aware of. And if they don't draw hands, what does it tell us? They're not aware of their hands. If they don't draw ears, why do we expect them to listen? Because they're not aware of their ears. So the Baby Gym Institute was founded to optimize brain development in a very playful way in the first 1,000 days. But immediately I thought, but what about the children that are older than 1,000 days from conception? Must we just leave them? No, we can't just leave them. And I thought, well, if movement develops the baby, movement is the catalyst for brain development in the first 1,000 days. Maybe if we mimic what the child missed in that time using movement, maybe we can help the brain to mature at a later stage as well. And we found it very, very helpful. And that's why I established a second institute for children from 3 to all the way to students, to adult and older people as well. So we mimic the movements of the baby to enable the brain to develop at an older stage. Because I'm from South Africa and we have a tremendous high poverty rate and a lot of people who have no jobs. There's no jobs. So no jobs, poverty. So because of that, equipment is very difficult, and too often people say, but I don't have the equipment to develop the baby. So in Africa, we have a saying, jy maak 'n plan, you make a plan. So it doesn't matter what happens. If you haven't got what you need, mark a plan, make a plan. And that's what we did at the Baby Gym and Mindfulness Institute. We assumed that God has no favorites, and therefore all people and all children can learn. We just need to help them to move in specific ways that will enable the brain and the sensory motor system to develop, that will enable them to develop posture, muscle tone, laterality, crossing the midline, a sense of sequence, rhythm, and coordinated smooth movements, and all the other fundamental physical skills that are needed before you can develop emotional skills, before you can develop visual and auditory perception, before you can develop the ability to speak, because even speech depends on physical development. So at the Baby Gym Institute, we do our utmost to optimize the development of babies. At the Mindfulness Institute, we do our utmost to catch up if there was a developmental crack that occurred in the first 1,000 days. So, wonderful. Movement enables the brain to develop, but is it any movement? No, it's not. You see, what our research has found, and it's based on many international researchers. It's based on the work of Peter Blythe and Sally Goddard. It's based on people from the work in Sweden, in Spain, in many other countries. But specifically, the work of Peter Blythe inspired us to look at the role of the primitive reflexes in the development of the nervous system. Remember, the nervous system is the communication network of the whole body. If the nervous system is not well developed, the body parts can't talk to each other. Yes, the brain is the mastermind of the whole body, but without the body, the brain can do nothing, because the brain needs the senses for input and the brain needs the muscles for output. So there are 3 steps. The senses talk to the brain and the brain talk to the muscles, and behavior is an output. It's a product of how well this process works. And if a child's behavior is not appropriate, if you ask a child to take out a book and the child says, "What?" and you say, "Take out the book," and they say, "Take out the book." "Yes, I've said take out the book." This book, you know, when they're constantly asking for affirmation that they're doing the right thing, or you ask them to go to the kitchen and fetch 3 apples, and they run, and then they stop and they say, "What must I do?" It's as though the brain loses the message. It's somewhere between the senses and the brain, the message got lost. Okay? But sometimes they understand. They know what to do, but the body doesn't want to do that. It's when a child wants to sit still, but they can't. They're constantly moving around. So with the primitive reflexes, I understood that nature gave each child inside a parent called a series of primitive reflexes, and they drive development from the inside, because some parents study. Some parents want to be very good parents, and they read many books and they watch many programs. Some parents do nothing, but all children develop. Why? Because inside all children are primitive reflexes. They're incredibly important, and there are many. There are hundreds of primitive reflexes. But at the Mindfulness Institute, we look at 11 that primitive reflexes that are very important, that systematically develops the child's sensory motor system. So what does that mean? Sensory, the sense of touch, the sense of movement, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, the sense of hearing, and the sense of sight. In that sequence, because if you look at embryology, you will see that's the sequence in which the senses of every child all over the world develops in the same way. Muscles develop in the same way. All babies, when they're born, if they can, they start feeding, so the mouth develops first, and then the neck, and then the core, and that's why they go through the same milestones all over the world. But what drives this process? It's the primitive reflexes. So there's a reflex called the withdrawal reflex. Some call it the fear paralysis reflex. That's mainly responsible for the development of the skin. There are 3 massive massive reflexes that are responsible for developing the sense of movement, which is fundamentally about the vestibular system. So that's the motor reflex, the tonic labyrinth reflex, and the asymmetric tonic neck reflex, ATNR. The rooting and sucking reflex is responsible for the development of smell and taste. The tonic labyrinth reflex is also, it's responsible for the vestibular system, but it's also responsible for developing hearing. And the ATNR, the one that I battled with a little bit earlier on, the asymmetric tonic neck reflex, is also responsible for developing the eyes. Isn't that amazing that everything in an adult's life is visual, but it's the last of the senses to develop? You see, the eyes only work very well and are ready for reading and for writing if all the senses are well developed. So each reflex triggers the sensory system using very specific movements to develop very specific parts of the nervous system, but specifically of the vestibular system. So let's quickly talk about this big word, the vestibular system. So the vestibular system is in the neck, and that's why in a baby, neck control is so important. And that's why in an older child, if a parent sees a child sits like this, they can't eat a meal sitting up. They always holding their head up, or when they write, they hold their head up with the one hand. It's a clear indication that the vestibular system still needs a little bit of development. And do you know how nature develops the vestibular system? Yes, through the primitive reflexes, but also through outdoor play. Because when a child looks up, it's in a way mimicking the tonic labyrinth reflex. Because when you look up with the tonic labyrinth reflex, all the muscles straighten. When you look down, the muscles bend. So when a child climbs up, they are using the pathways that the tonic labyrinth reflex has developed. Can you see there's a link between the primitive reflexes and playing outside? Some people think primitive reflexes are terrible because if they continue past 6 months after full-term pregnancy, so full-term pregnancy, 6 months later, the primitive reflexes need to go to rest because they're part of the survival part of the brain. An easy way to think of the brain is to think of the brain as a house. So the nervous system and the development of the physical body is like the foundation of a house. Everything starts there. It's the stability for emotional development, which on emotional development, think of that as the walls of a house because it creates safety and security. Physical development is the foundation for social development. Because if a child can't play like other children, they can't run, they can't skip, they can't jump, it influences their social development. It's difficult for them to be with other children. If I can just for a moment share something very personal, from a very early age, I've been a woman of substance. And so even as a child, so running games was not always my favorite games. And that's why I preferred games played in a circle where I didn't have to compete with the other children because they were always much, much faster than I am. And it's a problem today as well, that if children are a little bit big from an early age, they move less. And because they move less, they grow a little bit bigger and it becomes increasingly difficult for them to move. But there's always an opportunity and they can start swimming because when you swim, there's less pull from gravity and it's easier for the child to develop muscle tone to resist gravity. So once they're out of the swimming pool, they've got the muscle tone now to start learning to play a lot of other games. So the primitive reflexes are like, if you think of a symphony orchestra, they are the big moments in the development of the entire child, physically, emotionally, socially. In the house model, socially is represented by windows and door because it allows interaction. And then finally, the roof of the house is about cognition My dear friend and colleague Oleg Efimov from St. Petersburg is known to say the place in the body where gravity meets cognition is in the vestibular system. It's an absolutely profound statement, because I haven't said much about gravity yet, but the purpose of the vestibular system is to amplify the gravity, because it gives us, like a GPS, a sense of current location. And without current location, position, how do you figure out in which direction and which steps to follow to get to a destination? So what Oleg Efimov was saying, as a neurologist, he was saying the vestibular system is the place in the body where gravity meets cognition. So the roof of our model at the Mindness Institute represents cognitive development, and in cognitive development, all school-related subjects are up here. But if down here is not developed sufficient, it's not helpful. That is very often. At the Mindness Institute, we've done research over a period of years with thousands of children, thousands. And the research has shown that 77% of children with learning problems actually have a problem with the foundation. And if we say the foundation, we mean physical development. And if we are a little bit more specific, physical development has a lot, not all, but a lot to do about the development of the vestibular system. You know what is fascinating? At the Mindness Institute, I have simply looked at the movements that babies do and then mimic them. So I mimic those movements, and we wrap the ears to activate the vestibular system and the hearing apparatus. We trace the outline of the body, of the child's body, and we plant their feet to activate the proprioceptors and promote gravitational security. Because Jean is the mother of all occupational therapists, said that gravitational security is the first relationship that all children need to develop. How do you develop that? By fighting against gravity. So gravity is always a downward movement. Muscle tone is an opposing force. So gravity pulls down and muscle tone develops up. And it's the role of the vestibular system to develop that ability to fight gravity. Because, you know, so many children battle with concentration and attention deficit and lots of other things as well. But do you realize that when a child is battling with concentration and we say, concentrate, we are fools. Children are concentrating all the time. The question is, on what? Because they may be concentrating so much to fight the pull of gravity that they can't concentrate on what you are talking about or what the teacher is writing on the board. But they are concentrating. They are concentrating to fight gravity. But when the vestibular system is well developed, they don't have to fight gravity anymore. They fought it through child games, through playing the silly chasing games, playing games where children bend and the others jump over their back, rolling, going up and down, in and out. In South Africa, for example, because we've got a lot of animals, many of our games have animal names. So the one is the lion and the impala. Lion, I think you know, impala is a buck. And what happens? Lion eat buck. So the game is children are standing in a circle and the lion, two children are chosen. The one is the lion and the other one is a buck. They blindfolded, and then the children don't want the lion to catch the buck. So they call out lion, lion in one of the African language. But when the lion is close to the buck, they shout very loud and very quickly. So the buck knows the lion is very close. When the lion is far away, they say, lion, lion, slow and soft. It's auditory development. It's auditory processing in a children's game. And in playing those games, the blindfolded children are learning to really listen and spatial and use space to orientate themselves. Very important skills before any other academic skills. And the ones who are just playing, the ones who are the one who's the lion or the buck, they learn to listen, and the audience is learning to communicate. Because it doesn't matter how strong artificial intelligence becomes in the future. As human beings, we will always have to have the ability to listen to each other. We always have the ability to communicate with each other, because that way we will always outperform artificial intelligence even. So children's games are fundamental to brain development. Yes, to the vestibular system, but to brain development specifically, because the vestibular system is responsible for three planes of movement: backwards, forwards. It's responsible for left and right, and it's responsible for up and down. Think of saying yes, think of saying no, and think of playing that you are an aeroplane flying. Watch children at play, and you will see how often they spontaneously use movements that incorporate that kind of head movement. And then they also have straightforward movements where there are games where they need to move and stop. You know, whatever the game is, there are many games. In my language, in Afrikaans, we've got a game called Giffie Giffie Touches Raak Aan. Giffie Giffie Touches means poison, poison. Touch a specific color. It makes no sense, but that's children's games. So all the children have to run, look for a color and run. And the one that's the leader chase as many children as they and catch as many children as possible before they touch that color. What is that about? It's visual perception. It's spatial orientation. It's high-level decision making, because they need to analyze, they need to assess, analyze, make a decision on a split second. But they also develop something else, which is part of the basal ganglia, which is the stop and start neurons. Because you may notice in your own child or children that you work with that some children are very slow to start, or they are very slow to complete a task. And it may be because their start neurons are not as active as they can be. Some children are very quick to start, but they have no stop. They continue to move all the time. And we need the stop, because when we write letters, you need to stop. You need to start, but you definitely need to stop in specific places as well. I am absolutely passionate about natural games, because even though it is marvelous that there are many games that adults teach children, it's marvelous when children get the opportunity to come up with their own games. It's high-level cognitive thinking. Creativity is not something that's part of the foundation of the house. It's way up in the roof of the house. But what I find very sad, and when I prepared for this interview, and I want to encourage you to look on the internet when you Google games to see what comes up on the internet. It's not children's games. It's computer games. The things of the future. It's here to stay. There are marvelous games. There are games that expand the mind, that challenge on a level that I have not seen before. It is wonderful. After it sits up in the roof, it is not the foundation, because the way the human being is made, is designed, is physical movement first. And because traditional games were orally, they were transferred from generation to generation through speech. Adults were teaching the children these games. Maybe they didn't teach them, and maybe they just played with the children, and that's the way that the children learned these games. Maybe it's the time in our society at the moment, where we need to revisit children's games, where adults and children need to play again, especially just after the pandemic, because we all need to move again to stabilize our cognitive foundation, to stabilize our emotional well-being, to add the windows and doors to enable us to socialize again. All traditional games are played in a social environment where people are together, not individual lockdown in front of a cubicle or something where you absolutely in control. What's the difference? And then obviously that leads to tremendous cognitive development. Just in closing, the biggest difference between traditional games and marvelous, wonderful technology is with technology, you're constantly in control. There's no consequences, you can just reboot. When you play with real people, there's consequences to your choices. And that consequences is somebody can say, you don't follow the rules, you can't play with us anymore. And the consequences of that is shaping the emotional and social development of our children, the language of our children. So we can grow as a civilization to a much higher level. So if you're a parent or you're a teacher or a therapist, and you look at your child and you wonder, why is my child not like all other children? How do you know if you need to do something? There are things called SOS signals. You know, if in the olden days when there was a problem with a boat, they would send an SOS signal. The SOS stands for Save Our Souls, but what it actually meant is, help me. Listen to yourself. And the things that you very often say to your child is the things that you know you need to pay attention to. If you often say to your child, sit still, okay? The not sitting still is a SOS signal. That's why you often have to say, sit still. But if they could, they would. They can't. That's why they need help. If a child is biting their nails, or if they've got long hair, they suck their hair, or they suck the shirt, or they suck the collar. They keep on sucking something. It is, and you say, stop sucking everything. If they could, they would. So it means that's a reflex. That's the rooting and sucking reflex. Because that's rooting and sucking reflex says, I feel anxious, so I am sucking to soothe. Because it's fascinating. You know those three vestibular reflexes that we spoke about, the MORO, the TLR, and the ATNR? They are very uncomfortable reflexes. They always initiate anxiety. It's very, very interesting. But nature always follows with a calming reflex. After the MORO, comes the rooting and sucking. After the tonic labyrinth comes the palmar and the plantar. And after the ATNR, that's a more calming reflex. In any case, the baby is able to self-soothe because the baby would be older at that stage, and so with the child. So, if you notice in closing, a child is not sitting still, or the child is not sitting up, because they are always supporting the head or even lying on the arm. If you say something often, it's a SOS signal that says this child needs more outside play.